In the first part of this series, I made the slipcase for the pop-up box that the book sits in. In this video, I'll make the two trays that envelop the slipcase when the box is closed. I've got the slipcase, now I need to make two trays half the depth of the slipcase. That means more measuring. A difference between the slipcase and the book is that the slipcase is solid and more uniform. This might allow me to reduce tolerances slightly. Since I don't have to worry about the pesky dust jacket, I can reduce the additional 3mm on the height to 2, but for the four-edge to spine I add 2mm because I want to make sure the slipcase doesn't stop the box from closing. For the thickness I add the same 2mm again to ensure the box can close, and I add 5mm for the thickness of the base pieces because the walls butt up against the edges of the base. The base material is 2.3mm thick and two thicknesses is 4.6, which I round up to 5. When I made the slipcase, I rounded this down to 4, and there's that 0.6mm that could have been the difference between a very good fit and a perfect fit. That's all great. I have the dimensions of the trays. I divide the thickness by 2 to get the height of each tray, and I can start cutting board. Because these are open, I can line these after they're made, like the trays in the clamshell video. The thing is, as you'll see in a few minutes, I seem to have stuffed up somewhere. It's a nuisance thing, and I'll show how to correct it enough to make it acceptable. What is frustrating is that I don't know what the mistake is that I've made. I thought it would be obvious when I edited the video. I thought I must have added the thickness of the board to the tray heights after I'd divided the slipcase thickness by 2, but I didn't do that. Mystery still unsolved. Constructing the trays is the same as the slipcase, but easier since they don't have lids. I cut all the pieces of board based on the measurements of the slipcase. I laminate a piece of oversized card, 300 GSM or 10 point, to the bases of the trays. This time I don't forget to cut the slits for the ribbon. In the slipcase, the ribbon will slide through the slits. These slits will allow the ribbon to go to the outside of the trays to be securely attached. Once I've made the slits, I can attach the walls to the base, and once the glue is dried, I can trim the card around the edges, giving two nice solid identical trays. Now I can do a test for the slipcase inside the trays. My goal was to have a 1mm gap between the slipcase and the trays on each side, 2mm in total. What I find is at least 5mm. This is very disappointing and puzzling. Rounding up, Even compounding can't account for this. After I go have a coffee and think about it, I decide this gap's too large. But I also decide I don't have to remake the trays. I can fill in the bottom of the trays with some heavy card and reduce this gap. I might not get it to within 2 millimeters, but close enough. If I leave doing this until after covering the walls, then the fill-in card will hide the bumps from the wall covering material on the inside of the base, and no one is going to notice the walls are a bit unusually thick as it's inside the trays. For now, I can carry on as normal and cover the walls. In the videos I've made on the basics of making trays, I demonstrate two methods for covering them. Since the outside of the base of these trays will be glued to a case, they don't need to be covered, just the walls. This makes choosing the method easy. I can use the wrap around the edges method. An obvious difference is that these trays have 3 walls instead of 4. How to deal with the open side? I'll put that idea aside for now. For a start, I'll cut some cloth to cover the walls. It needs to be long enough to wrap around the 3 sides with 20 millimeters or thereabouts at each end. The width is enough to extend 20 millimeters onto the outside of the base, up the wall, down the inside, and another 10 millimeters onto the inside of the base. I also add 2 millimeters to go over the top of the wall. I draw a reference line 20 millimeters from the edge to align the tray to. When I started making videos, I mostly stuck to subjects that I knew well and followed the techniques that I used all the time, things I'd been taught in workshops, had had described to me by other bookbinders, that I'd read about in books or newsletters, or seen demonstrated at bookbinding meetings and events. Very little, if any, came from the internets. I was very aware that there were many ways to approach tasks in bookbinding, and I had experimented with different approaches. What I usually did was demonstrate my preferred approach. Because something worked best for me, I assumed it was the best way. If someone did it different to me, I think I assumed it was just because they didn't know about the methods that I'd chosen as best, or of course they would change. Once I decided to get serious about YouTube, I set myself a goal of doing a video a week for 2 years. Apparently, this would guarantee success on YouTube, which of course I proved wrong. I decided I didn't want to only use my preferred methods of doing things. I wanted to highlight the diversity of bookbinding. This is when I started doing more in-depth research, trying to find other approaches. The journals and newsletters of bookbinding organisations were a huge source of this type of information, so were blogs by professional bookbinders and the Guild of Bookworkers standards videos. Over 2 years, I used a lot of different techniques. I found the most diversity in methodology in box making. Forcing myself to use different approaches, I found there were often no obvious best way. They were often about the same amount of work, required similar technical ability, did what they were supposed to do, and looked about the same, yet were different. So, how do you decide which approach to use? Given 3 ways to deal with the corners when covering a tray, which do I use? What I've found is that I still have a favourite method, which is often the first technique I learned. I still prefer to do the little mitre cut over the top of the wall at the corner, even though the overlapping tongue might have advantages. But having different approaches in my toolbox gives me options when one technique won't work for some reason. When I had to deal with that white stripe when covering the slipcase, I couldn't do the little mitre, but then I realised the other approach with the tongue would work and would hide the mistake. So why am I talking about this? My plan was to cover this tray just like I did in the clamshell enclosures video. But at that critical moment just seconds ago, when I cut that corner material out, I ruled that option out. Surely I planned these videos better. How did I make this mistake? I made a prototype a few days before and I did it the way I'd planned, just fine. But that morning I'd been working on another slipcase and I trimmed that corner just like at the opening of a slipcase. Sure, it's annoying to be reminded that my mind is not as sharp as when I was 20 years younger, but now I have more experience and I simply swap to a different technique and cut a tongue from the remaining material to cover the edge at the corner, and once the tray is lined and wrapped over the edge, the finished result will look the same. What's the lesson to take from this? I became a much better bookbinder when I started learning different ways of working and got out of the habit of always doing things the same way. There are bad habits that you can get into that are worth avoiding. You'll never see me squeezing glue right out of a bottle onto the job, for instance. And there are some approaches that I think are so much better, such as laminating some card to the base when making a tray, that it would be rare for me to do it any other way. I think this is worth considering. If you decide you want to make this pop-up box and want to practice a few slipcases first, don't do them all the same. I have a few slipcase videos which all have variations in them. Maybe make 3 slipcases following 3 different videos, and then you can pick the approach that felt best for you. My original motivation for making bookbinding videos was to provide access to techniques from the traditional bookbinding community. The quality of material on YouTube when I started posting in 2019 was terrible. The 2 exceptions are no longer active and their videos have dated. Unfortunately, the situation on YouTube has almost got worse in regards to bookbinding. The exception is Ido Agassi. His technique is clearly based on years of experience and quality training. He comes from a very different bookbinding tradition than mine, and I find it interesting watching how he works. I see nothing of mine in his work, which is so refreshing. I doubt he's even heard of me, which is great. If you're serious about bookbinding, I recommend you watch his videos to see a very different perspective. And then you can wonder why we have very different recommendations on laminating materials. I'm not a fan of how he hypes things YouTuber fashion, but maybe I'm just jealous that I'm no good at it. Now you're wondering what the third approach is. I was just fact-checking some details with the well-known book Boxes for the Protection of Rare Books by Margaret Brown from the Library of Congress, and I noticed a technique I haven't used before. I'll look into this more, and you might see this in a future video. I'm finally going to get back to dealing with that space between the trays and the slipcase. I'm going to use some 0.6mm card, or 20 point, to build the inside of the trays up. I simply cut it to fit inside the trays, glue it out and put it in position. I don't have to worry about it stretching because it's so thick. To line the trays, I'm using the same material as I used to cover the slipcase. I know my choice of colours and decorative paper is a bit conservative, but that's just me. If you're after inspiration for something a bit more daring, just look up Peller pop-up box. If you do look these up, you'll notice a lot of people use a slightly rounded spine. These look great on the shelf, but I think the flat spine works best for opening this box. If you do want to do the curved spine, I'd recommend using leather for the spine as it molds to the curved shape much better, but do it in a quarter covering style to save on leather. I've always built the spine piece up with binder's board and then sanded it to shape. It's a pain in the neck and I haven't done it much for this reason. The gap between the trays and slipcase is still a bit more than I wanted, but it's acceptable. I've gone back and checked my working and measurements over and over. I've come to the conclusion that I did not keep track of how I was measuring and introduced a systematic error in that I rounded up at each step. This has just compounded more than I expected. I'm not sure what to take from this, except bookbinding never stops surprising you. That's the tray done. I'll cut the slits through the lining material in the next video. Making the case and putting it all together is probably the most interesting and fun part of the build. If you're watching this video soon after it's published, then I'm at the Bind 25 bookbinding conference, partying with my bookbinding friends. If you ever get a chance to go to a bookbinding conference, I highly recommend it. Until next time, cheerio.